Um, we are going to hear today from Lorraine Atchison of Innovate UK, Joel Ferguson from KTN, and Susan Kelly from Respiratory Analytics. Please use the Q&A function for your questions throughout the hour, and we'll answer as many as we possibly can. By the end of the webinar, I hope you'll have a better understanding of the Innovate UK application process, whether it's appropriate for your type of business, and fingers crossed you'll have also increased your chances of being successful in getting funding as well. We'll hear from Lorraine and Joel first, and then we'll hear from Susan Kelly, who's CEO of Respiratory Analytics. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lorraine.
Thanks, Trudy, and I'm going to share my screen with you all. There we go. Everyone can see that, I'm assuming. Thumbs up from Trudy. Lovely. Well, it's really, I guess, a great privilege of mine to sit here today and take your lunch hour and talk to you about Innovate UK funding. And as Trudy said, hopefully give you the opportunity to be successful. So really what we want to do today is just demystify access to Innovate UK funding. So often I hear from businesses who are confused, really. It's a really busy funding landscape in Northern Ireland. I think we're so lucky because there's funding available from Invest Northern Ireland, there's funding available from Innovate UK, there's often European funding or Intertrade Ireland funding. And the impression I get from talking to businesses, actually, businesses perhaps don't really care where the funding comes from, but they just want to get funding to help support their innovation that they're so passionate about. So what we really wanted to do is just demystify that for you today, to help you understand how you can access Innovate UK funding and to give you some really practical hints and tips about how you can write a compelling grant application. And most importantly, actually, I think, is to hear from a business who has been successful. So we'll be hearing from Susan Kelly from Respiratory Analytics. What today isn't is a detailed guide to all the different funding options that are available. You know, I guess as I've alluded to, there is a lot of funding available and it can be a minefield, but we haven't got time for that today. And what we also won't be doing today is giving an overview of any existing competitions. But if you do want to find out about our existing competitions, all the competition details are available on our website. And I'd really encourage you to sign up to alerts so that they can come into your inbox easily. At any one time, we might have between 10 and 25 competitions available. They're all slightly different. So it is important that you have a look to see which competition might be suitable for you. And we always have a briefing event which is recorded, so you can watch that in your own time to hear more details about the competitions. So that's what we're hoping to achieve today. But I wanted to start by just really getting you thinking about Innovate UK funding. Wake you up a wee bit. I guess I can't see to have hands raised, but if you wanted to put some thoughts into the chat to answer these or just answer it in your head, please do. So my first question is, how much do you think Innovate UK has committed in grants for innovation, R&D to businesses here in Northern Ireland over the last 5 years? So 75 million, 95 million, 110 million. So the answer is 110 million. We've given out 110 million in funding to businesses here in Northern Ireland over the last 5 years. And what proportion of our applications do you think come from Northern Ireland? So 1.5%? 2.5%, 3.5%. I think we're about 3% of the UK population here in Northern Ireland, aren't we? So the answer is 1.5%. We get the least amount of applications from Northern Ireland. But when businesses from Northern Ireland do apply, what we know is they're just as likely, if not slightly more likely, to be successful than businesses in other parts of the UK. And that leads me to my last question. So what do you think the average success rate is of Northern Irish applications for Innovate UK funding? So when we look across all of our competitions, the average success rate is about 1 in 4. So I think it's actually about 27%. But what we also know is that the success rate does vary depending on the competition and how many applications we get. So some competitions are really, really popular and we get lots and lots of applications, and that does mean that success rates are lower. And what we have seen in recent months and really over the last year is a huge increase in applications to us from across the UK, as well as from Northern Ireland. And I'm telling you that today, I'm kind of keen to raise awareness of that. Not to scare you or to put you off applying, but just to make you really think about when you apply to us that you want to be putting your best foot forward, because it is a competition and you really want to give yourself the best chance. And I guess that's why you are here today, to hear about how to do that. So that gives you a bit of context. But to carry on that context and say a little bit about Innovate UK, we're the UK's innovation agency. And what we basically mean by that is that we are the vehicle by which UK government funds innovation in the UK. So if UK government wants to give funding to businesses to innovate, to do research and development, they give that money through us, and we give it to businesses via competitions. And I think that word innovation can feel a wee bit bandied around nowadays. Often when people hear the term innovation, they're perhaps picturing somebody in a white coat in a lab. And absolutely, innovation is happening in labs led by people in white coats. But it's also so much more than that. And put most simply, we see innovation as being impact that comes from new ideas. And why we are so excited and committed to supporting innovation is that we know it accounts for a really large proportion of productivity growth. And that's about doing things better in less time with less resources. And we know that as a business, if your business is innovative, it's more likely to grow faster and to export more. And that's good for everybody. It's good for your business, but it's good for the UK economy as a whole. So how do we allocate our funding? Well, we run a wide range of competitions, and predominantly, and what we're perhaps most famous for, is our grants, but we also offer loans, and we also offer equity partnerships where programs give equity funding from a VC and then matched by a grant from Innovate UK. The whole application process is done online. All of the guidance is written and available online, and as I mentioned earlier, we always hold briefing events. Pre-COVID, these were held face-to-face, but nowadays they're just a recording, and the recording's available. So it makes it really accessible. They tend to be quite short and snappy and allow you to understand what the competition's about, how you apply, and if it's for you. Depending on the competition scope, sometimes we will want projects to be led by a single applicant and only include one business, but frequently they can be collaborative. And what I mean by collaborative is that you might collaborate with another business, another SME, or a large company, or with the university. The amount of funding available depends on each competition, and there's a sliding scale for the business receiving that funding. So as an SME, if you were doing a feasibility study, so an early stage study, typically you would get 70% of project costs covered. Whereas if you were a large business doing a feasibility study, it'd be typically about 50%. All our applications are peer reviewed by up to 5 independent assessors, and we have a quality threshold. So typically the quality threshold is 70%, and typically we ask 10 questions that are unweighted, which means you really need to be scoring at least 7 out of 10 for each one to achieve over 70%. But there's 2 things here I wanted to flag. One is that we know, as we've seen the increase in applications to Innovate UK, actually whilst 70% is our quality threshold, often many applications are scoring way in excess of 70%. So you really want to be maximising your score for every question. And the second thing is that competitions do vary. And so whilst I say our standard questions will be out of 10 and there'll be 10 questions, in some competitions we're asking fewer questions or perhaps 1 or 2 more. So it does really depend. But as a rule of thumb, everything's scored out of 100, and you're really wanting to be looking at scoring over 70% and higher. Feedback is provided to all unsuccessful applicants. So we ask each assessor to give a score for each question and a line of feedback, as well as an overall line of feedback at the end. And this is really helpful. When I've spoken to businesses, they value that feedback that they get, and they can actually use that to resubmit an application in the future. So you can resubmit an application for another competition. You can have the same project, or you can change the project entirely. So there's not a maximum number of times that you can apply for our funding. But what I do suggest is that you really consider the suitability of the fund that you're applying for. As you'll hear from Joel, it can be quite a long process, really getting your application right. So you really want to give yourself the best possible chance and make sure that it is the right competition for you. And if you are in any doubt, if you've got any questions with regard to the scope, with regard to your eligibility, if you're not sure about the finances, then please contact our customer support. When I first started this role, working for Innovate UK a few years ago, and I spoke to people about customer support, sometimes I felt like it was a bit anonymous, and I was perhaps suggesting you just to ring an anonymous helpline. But our customer support is really there to accurately answer questions related to our competitions. As I've said, we've got numerous competitions live at any time, and they're experts in them and giving you the right advice. And what we also are able to do is track the calls and the questions we're being asked, to make sure that we are also improving our own processes and our frequently asked questions in order to be able to give the right advice to businesses. And what I will say is that you're not blacklisted for asking too many questions. There is no stupid question. The support is there for you, so you can give yourself the best possible chance of submitting a compelling application. So that's just a whistle stop really at a high level of our funding and why we fund. I'm going to be on at the end to answer any questions, and I shall hand back now to Trudy.
Thanks, Lorraine. Just a question from me. Why do you think Northern Ireland is behind other areas of the UK, both in applications and in successful applications as well?
Sure. So I guess to clarify, the success rates are the same, if not slightly higher. So the numbers are often can be deceiving. So that when we see lower numbers compared with other regions in the UK, it is because of the number of applications coming through, as opposed to us awarding less proportionately to Northern Ireland. And I think one of the reasons is actually a good reason. It's the fact that there's a lot of funding available here already, which can make the landscape confusing, admittedly, but there's already funding available locally, R&D funding from Invest Northern Ireland, for instance, and businesses also access support through Intertrade Ireland, for instance. So I think it's a really busy landscape. So I think that's one of the reasons businesses aren't coming to us. The second reason I think is comms and understanding, and I think sometimes businesses can see our competitions, the size of the funds, I think sometimes can look off-putting. So we might run a £25 million competition, and a local business, an SME perhaps is thinking, well, my project's 50k, so it doesn't fit into a £25 million. So there's perhaps a misunderstanding or a mismatch, because actually we have large funding pots, but often we'll have projects at 25k as well as up to perhaps 3 million. So I think there's a comms issue. I think there is other resources out there issue, and I think the third and the last issue is perhaps the fact that our funding is competitive, and that's why we run these grant masterclasses. I think sometimes people can be put off by the nature of it. I think what we know locally, and in my pre-COVID days, I'm based at Invest Northern Ireland. I work with colleagues really closely there. Obviously, Invest Northern Ireland is very visible, and they work closely with their client companies, and people have a named contact. And I guess Innovate UK can perhaps look a lot more anonymous, and so it's maybe less easy to navigate. So I think they're the reasons why people may not be applying. But as I said, in this last year, we are seeing an increase in applications from Northern Ireland, which is great. The success rate has never been an issue. We're getting quality of applications, but we do want to see more.
Right. Am I right in thinking as well that there's not like a pot of money for Northern Ireland and a pot of money for Scotland? It is one UK-wide pot, so you're competing with people from all over the UK for the funding?
Absolutely. No, you're right, Trudy. So it's UK funds, and we give it out on the basis of where the best projects are. But what we know is that there are great projects here in Northern Ireland, and in Scotland and Wales and England. And that's why, and I should have said at the beginning, my role is Innovate's manager for Northern Ireland. And when my team was put in place nearly 5 years ago, this was about making sure we had people on the ground in all corners of the UK. Because I think sometimes there's a perception and sometimes a reality that the money goes to London and to Cambridge and to Oxford and those places, and it doesn't come to Newry and Derry and Aberdeen and Inverness and Swansea. So, but what we know is that there's great ideas and there's innovation everywhere, and we want to be working closely with the local stakeholders in all parts of the UK to ensure that our funding does go to all corners of the UK.
That's great. Okay, for the moment, Lorraine, thank you very much. We'll now go over to Joel Ferguson from the Knowledge Transfer Network. And Joel, you have something called the Assessor's Prayer, is that right, to talk us through?
Yeah, so thanks, Trudy. I suppose to introduce me, I'm Joel Ferguson. I'm a Senior Knowledge Transfer Advisor with KTN. I work mostly on the KTP program, but I work across other areas as well. But KTP is the Knowledge Transfer Partnerships, is the program that I spend most of my time supporting. I was doing a quick sort of sum or estimate of many applications I've assessed since I've been doing this role, which is probably about 7 years, and I think I've probably assessed about 400 or 500 for KTP, but I've been an assessor in other programs, Horizon 2020, and I've sat on the other side of the fence as well before I took this role on, and applied from everything from innovation vouchers to, I've had my own company before I got involved with KTN. I had a couple of successful SBRI applications as well. So, but today is really, as you say, Trudy, it's the assessor's prayer. It's looking at this from an assessor's perspective, and I don't think there's any kind of magic secrets to writing a good application, but I'll try and talk through some of the things that I think are helping you need to sort of pay attention to. Could the next slide, please? Yeah, so the three areas that I'm going to cover are, answering the question and telling a good story, putting yourself in the assessor's shoes and looking at it from an assessor's perspective, and I'll finish up then just with some of the things that, in my mind are sort of the big ones, or the most obvious things, or most common things that we see that go wrong with application, or the things to really sort of pay attention to by way of tips and pointers. Next slide. So yeah, the assessor's prayer. So it's a bit tongue in cheek, but if you put yourself in the assessor's shoes, that they quite often receive maybe 10, 20 applications, and they'll have maybe 2 weeks to assess these and score them, and try and give objective feedback. So as an assessor, you're always looking for a good application. If you get a really good application, it really stands out as being clear, easy to read, it ticks the boxes, and it's an actual pleasure to read. On the other side of it, if you get an application that's poorly constructed, it's difficult to find the answers you're looking for, it doesn't read well, it's a real chore to read through. And for a KTP, a really good application I can assess in an hour. A poor one or a mediocre one sometimes can take 2 hours or even 3 hours to go through, and it's laborious. It's difficult to read some applications and try to really sort of be objective in the kind of feedback that you're given. But I suppose that the key thing is, as Lorraine said, all these grant funding schemes it's competitive. So you need to make sure it's a really good application. You need to stand out as being one of those ones that the assessor is going to actually find it easy to read and easy to score well. Next slide, please. So I suppose the first and most obvious thing is answer the question. It sounds pretty obvious, but you really need to read the criteria for each question. There's normally a guide around each question that you need to look at, and I suppose understand where Innovate UK and the assessors will be coming from. What is it they're looking for? And the guidance that comes with each question should really set that out. So the first thing is get your head around, don't make assumptions, read the guidance and get your head around exactly what the assessor is looking for. Lorraine touched on this as well. You need to score highly to get a project funded. You need to score highly across all of the questions. So it's not, if you've got in your mind that, I'm really strong in this area, a bit weaker in that one, you really need to work on all areas and make sure it's presented well right across the board. It's important as well, that the assessor isn't judging your business, and they're not judging, you or, your credibility. They're judging the words on a page. So, they don't have the time to go off and do Google searches or background searches on you. It's what you put in the page is what they read and what they'll assess. So, you need to make sure that you answer the questions and give the information that they need to allow them to score it well. I think one of the really, really, really important things for me is make sure that it reads well. Make sure that it all, from start to finish, it's an easy read. Don't make it overly technical if it does, where it doesn't need to be. If it is technical, make sure it's explained, but make sure it's a clear, easy read from start to finish, and is consistent and cohesive. People talk about a golden thread through an application, which is kind of that, you read the start and basically everything sort of fits together as you read through the application, and each part complements the other part, and it's really cohesive. One of the other things that, as a pointer, avoid red flags. So if you take a step back and read your application like an assessor would, if you see anything in there that might raise a doubt in the assessor's mind, that something hasn't been answered correctly, or piece of information is missing, as an assessor's reading through, they'll be looking for I call them flags, that you want to read the response to a question and not have any doubts or unanswered questions at the end of it. So if we're reading sections and we see red flags, it's all, you're building these things up in your mind that this may not be as as good an application as it could be. Next slide, please. So I'm going to very quickly just jump through some of the typical questions. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in them because the questions and the guidance can change from competition to competition, but very generally, I'll just go through and give a few pointers. First thing is in terms of scope. Scope is usually the first thing that the assessor reads, and generally when they get to the end of it, it's a yes, no answer. And if it's a no, then it's out of scope, and it's quite often not assessed. So it's really important to check the scope of the competition and make sure that the project you're bringing forward meets the scope, and that you've articulated how it meets the scope, because it's a yes, no, and if you don't tick the box of that one, then it generally doesn't get taken further. Next slide, please. So the other thing I think, partly by way of a tip, is first impressions. So generally up front, there might be a public description, which is fine. It's not assessed. It's just a short description that's usually published in a database somewhere around, for Innovate to list all the projects that are funded. But somewhere up front, there's usually a summary part, or a question that allows you to give a summary of the project. And for me, when I'm assessing, that's a really, really important question, because when I read that, I want to really understand what the project's about and get it. And if you read the summary and then you go into some of the other maybe specific questions that are dealing with aspects of the application, and you still don't really understand what the project's trying to do or what it's really about, you're fighting a kind of an uphill struggle to really understand the project. So I think the summary is really important, just to get across, succinctly, simply, clearly, this is what the project's about, and this is why we think it should be supported. So it's a really important, sometimes overlooked question up front in the application. Next slide, please. So the second thing, and this can vary from competition to competition as well, but there's usually a question around the need or the opportunity. It sounds pretty obvious, but you need to articulate what the opportunity is, typically what the market opportunity is, and something I come back to and give people advice is to evidence that. So don't assume that the assessor will know your sector, your market, and know that what you're doing is a really big opportunity. You need to provide evidence of why, particularly drilling down into the actual offer that you're bringing forward, and why people will be interested in taking that on board or buying that. So what's the market doing? What's driving that? What's the current state of the art, and what's the unmet need out there, and why is it something that people will really bite your arm off if your project's successful to buy from you. Next slide, please. The second bit then is usually a question around the idea, your approach, and the level of innovation. And in this, it's important, if you've talked about the state of the art before or here, it's important to show how you move beyond that. And again, innovation, not surprisingly, is a really important aspect of any Innovate UK application. So you really need to sell how what you're doing is innovation, and how it really moves your sector on, ideally to be something to put you at the leading edge of your sector nationally or internationally. So articulate and evidence that relative to what the current state of the art is. Things like freedom to operate, again, knowing the competition, knowing the current IP landscape, and being able to evidence that you've looked at that, and that you have freedom to operate is important as well. And also, is the market ready for what you're doing? Again, that'll come out a little bit later, probably in the market section as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the team, resources, delivery, you're trying to show that you've got a compelling team, and I think one way to look at that is to take a step back and look at what roles are needed to deliver the project, and then how do you fill them. So rather than just saying this is who we are, and someone gave me this advice when I was applying for SBRI funding a few years back, what are the roles that you need to make this project successful, and also to make it commercially successful at the end? And in doing that, you might spot that your team isn't as full as it could be. When I applied for SBR, it was a one-man band, so it was clear that I needed maybe some more commercial weight in the project team, for example. The tip that I got was to use some of the project funding to bring in advisors or experts to help oversee the project and help advise in different aspects. And I used a little bit of the funding to do that and help build the right team to deliver the project that way. So those weren't equity partners in the business, or they were people that I brought in just to help make the team complete. Don't overlook things like project management. If it's a technical team, that commercial focus, who's bringing that, and oversight of the project as well. How are you going to do that? will you have a project team, project board that'll meet and review progress and make kind of key decisions. For resources, justify them, particularly if there's anything that jumps out that might be a bit unusual. So yeah, justify the kind of resources that you're looking for in your applications on your project as well. And the plan, if you put together a plan, make sure it delivers on the project. Sometimes we see applications that talk about delivering a product at the end of a project, a prototype or whatever, and then you see a plan which is very technical, which doesn't produce something or take it to market and test it. So make sure whatever you write in the application marries up with the plan. Next slide, please. Market awareness this section is very much like the I suppose on the next section, very much like a business plan. So it's on the kind of information you put in there. So how are you going to monetize the outputs of your project? What's your model? What's the market size? Quantify it, and particularly look at the trends in the market, talk about those, describe them, use evidence if you can point to reports and things that back up what you're saying, and in particular drill into the actual bit of the market you're addressing and articulate why that market needs what you're providing, why it's not met at the minute, or the needs unmet, and why you think you've got the solution that people will be will want to buy. Talk about your competition, where you fit in, and hopefully describe why what you're doing is innovative and is going to be new and exciting in the sector that you're working in. And as I say, evidence things, show that you validated the market, you talk to customers, and put some numbers and some evidence around the information that you provide as well. Next slide, please. So outcomes and route to market. Again, pretty much like a business plan. Who are your customers? Provide evidence that you understand them, you've engaged with them. How are you going to grow the business? What's your sort of strategy for doing that? Is it who are you going to where are you going to sell first, and what way? How are you going to scale that? There might be kind of reference sites that you're looking at, or you might have relationships with certain customers that might be keen to trial your products and so on. Are you going to work with partners, distributors, collaborators? Describe those kind of aspects. I suppose that let the assessor know that you've thought all this through and you've got a realistic plan for how to take things forward that's credible and has been well thought through. Next slide, please. Risk is usually asked. You're usually asked to address risk in your application as well, and normally it's in the usual kind of risk register approach. Highlighting the risks, scoring them, and how you're going, what the impact of the risk might be, how you're going to mitigate the risks. Risk is important. It's what the assessor will be looking at when they look at risk is, has this person really thought through all aspects of this project? The technical, the commercial, and is everything that they're saying in the application being thought through, and they really know how to deal with these, the potential problems that might come along either in the project or post-project, but usually it's they're talking about the project itself. So it's, don't play them down, be realistic about them, and it's a useful thing to do anyway, and I think it helps you plan the project a little bit better and think about how you're commercializing as well. Next slide, please. Costs, additionality, value for money. Read the rules in terms of cost. Sometimes there's rules around equipment and things and depreciation. So make sure you understand what are eligible costs. Justify them. Make it proportionate. If it's a fairly minor cost, might not need a lot of justification. If it's unusual or pretty chunky part of your application, then you'll probably want to explain that. In terms of additionality, again, you'll probably be asked, to address that. Why are public funds needed? So if you're a company with deep pockets, got a lot of expertise in-house, then why do you need this funding? Why couldn't you do it anyway? So you're usually looking at things that are, the funding's going to, without the funding, the project may not happen at all. It may be allowing you to collaborate with people you couldn't normally collaborate with. It may accelerate your time to market, allow you to pull together the right team. But that demonstrating that additionality for the funding is important. And increasingly, you're seeing things now around broader impact, societal impact, and things like net zero. So if they talk about societal impact, don't overlook it. And that could just be the, getting that level of impact or describing things like societal impact and so on might be the kind of thing that differentiates your application by that point or 2 points that might just make the difference in tipping you into the list of projects that are funded. Next slide, please. So that's a quick run through, maybe some pointers just in some of the questions. The next bit I wanted to talk about was putting yourself in a little bit more about putting yourself in the assessor's shoes. Next slide, please. So yeah, back to the assessor's prayer. So, take a step back when you're writing your application and read it and think, is this going to be a little bit tongue in cheek, but this going to be an application that an assessor is going to enjoy reading? Is it going to make them feel good? Is it going to make it easy for them to score my application well? And if anything tells you that that may not be the case, looking at it through completely new eyes, or even better, get someone to read it who hasn't been involved in writing the application. And if there are things in there that are snags, potential red flags or whatever, then it's probably not ready and needs a bit more work. Next slide, please. So sometimes we talk about, the difference between good and great. And, Innovate UK funding is competitive, and writing a good application is probably not going to make it stand out and put it into the pile that gets funded. You should really aim for your application to be great right across all the board, all the assessment criteria and all the questions. So, if it's at the bottom, kind of unclear, or there are question marks, it won't get funded. If it's good and it's okay right across the board, it probably won't. So you need to strive for, having a great answer to every question right across the board, because as Lorraine said, sometimes questions are weighted, but often they aren't. So you could have a really innovative project and not have described the market or other aspects of it well, and it'll pull the score down overall and risk the project not getting funded. Next slide, please. So these are some of the things that are red flags that sort of jump out sometimes when you're reading an application to look out for. Make sure it's in scope. If it's not, it's probably out of the competition, out of assessment. Make sure you're eligible as a partner. Sometimes we see applications that come from companies that are part of groups. I had an application recently from a company which was part of a Japanese group, and it wasn't clear where the benefit was going to reside from the project. So make sure that you meet the criteria in terms of eligibility as a partner, and that the benefits are going to accrue in the right place. Really important. Make sure it's not overly technically. The language isn't overly technical. It's not difficult language to read. If you're using acronyms, explain them, but probably best to avoid them. Sometimes people say, write it so that a 15-year-old could pick it up and understand it, and it's probably not a bad tip. The assessor may have background from your sector, but quite often they certainly won't have the level of expertise that you do. So write it in a way that a non-expert could pick it up and understand it as far as you can. Poorly articulated offer, not clear what the market opportunity is unclear, maybe sometimes what the level of innovation is relative to the existing marketplace. Again, market opportunity maybe not well described or quantified, route to market the same. Sometimes you get plans that are very commercial and very technical and lack that commercial focus. And sometimes you get conflicting statements in an application, particularly if it's written by different people, and that's something to be careful of. If different people are writing parts of the application, make sure you're all on the same page before you start, in terms of being clear what everyone's role is, because sometimes if people come with different perspectives, it just reads like different applications that aren't really cohesive. Next slide, please. The last thing I just wanted to go through was a few sort of tips, and probably restating some of the things I've said before. Next slide, please. So one tip, don't leave it too late. Applications take a lot longer than you think to prepare. So it'll take you 3 times as long probably to write a good application as you think before you start. And don't leave it close to the deadline. Pretty much in every competition there's a surge close to the deadline, and some don't make it because of technical issues or problems. So try not to leave it to the last minute, because it's a shame to put all the work in and not actually get it submitted if there's a problem close to the deadline. And Innovate UK are pretty inflexible when it comes to, I'm sorry I didn't get it in because it's in or it's not. Next slide, please. Important one, I think, just overall, is just make sure what you pull together stands out for all the right reasons. Really clear, really cohesive application that ticks all the boxes, and make it the one that the assessor reads and goes, I actually enjoyed that, and hope all the rest are as good as that one. So work it until it's really well presented. Next slide, please. And I suppose just to finish off, probably a recap on some of the things. Put yourself in the assessor's shoes when you're reviewing your application. Before you even start, with your collaborators, make sure everyone's clear about what everyone's role is, what the project's about, what the outcomes are going to be, what everyone needs to do as part of the project. Because sometimes you see applications that are written too early, and people put everything on the page, and then it's very difficult to change and rework fundamental problems with how the team's structured and what everyone needs to do if it's not right at the start. So it's better to get that right before you start doing the application. Make sure obviously it's a good fit with the call in terms of scope. Step back and read the application like a critical assessor, and be prepared to refine it. I don't think an application's ever ready in the first draft. It takes 2 or 3 drafts to make it really, really good. And it has to be really easy to read and to get on the first pass. If it's not, you're risking losing the assessor when they're reviewing it. Is the project sold really clearly early on? That summary thing, is there somewhere up front at the start that really sort of just communicates what the project's about really clearly and succinctly? That's really important. No matter where you do it, it's really important to have it early on in the application. Are the statements evidenced? Look for red flags, deal with them if you spot them when you're reviewing it, and allow more time than you think. And I think it might have been a session like this that Lorraine actually delivered probably about 6 or 7 years ago that I was at, about SBRI, where I think someone said it takes 40 to 60 hours to write a really good application. And I thought, it'll not take me that long. I kind of know what I'm doing. I'll get it done in a day or two. And 3 or 4 weeks later, I went back and counted up the time, and it was probably easily, touching 50 hours of time that it took to actually write it. So in my view, it takes a long time to write a really good application. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time. Next slide, please. Some resources online at the KTN website. There's a good application guide that you can get and have a look at, which you can download. I think that this will be shared afterwards, so you can hopefully access the links. And for information generally around KTN's kind of support, if you register on the website, you should get sort of updates. And I think I've got one last slide. Yeah, so that's me finished. So thank you very much. Quick plug at the end. I support a program called KTP, Knowledge Transfer Partnerships. The website's ktp-uk.org. Have a look there, and if that program's of interest, then drop me an email and I can hopefully tell you a bit more about it. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joel. If we could just go to 2 questions in the Q&A box at the minute. Is funding available for university spin-out companies through these schemes?
Yeah, that's probably one that Lorraine would pick up in terms of specific schemes, but certainly, well, I'll let you answer, Lorraine.
Well, yeah, I jumped in there, didn't I? Absolutely, I guess is the short answer. And we do work really closely with both Ulster and Queen's here in Northern Ireland, and there's a good track record of spin-outs getting funding from us. So it's probably worth talking to your, the business teams inside the university that you're involved with, but absolutely we do fund spin-outs.
Great, thank you. And I can just clarify as well that both slide decks will be available as PDFs on the frameworks page of the Catalyst website as well in the next day or 2. Okay, thank you. I don't think Susan has managed to join us yet from Easy Hill, so we'll plow on here. I have lots of questions, so we're not to worry. Lorraine, can you talk a wee bit about, if you're successful in getting your funding, how is your progress monitored during the duration of the? Oh, Susan is join us. Great. Okay.
And actually, Susan would answer that question really well, probably, because I could give you my version, but she'll probably give you the warts and all version.
Well, let's get the warts and all version, Susan, if we can hear from Susan at all. Maybe not. We'll try and sort that out. Lorraine, what's your description?
Sure. So, oh, there's Susan now. She's just switching on her mic.
Hi, Susan. Lovely to see you. So, can you first of all, can you tell us a wee bit about your respiratory analytics and your experiences with Innovate UK?
Yes, sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm not sure if I have an awful lot of value to add after Lorraine and Joel, because they've done such a really thorough job of explaining the process. But as a fortunate recipient, I'm very happy to recount my experience if that's helpful. So in terms of the award that we hold, we were successful in getting a SMART award last year. It was a really competitive environment last year. I guess it probably won't be any less competitive this year, but yeah, we were successful. Just for sort of historic content or context, we had applied in the past and been unsuccessful, largely apart from making all the mistakes that were described earlier. Lorraine may recall one frantic telephone call from me at Halloween a couple of years ago when we'd missed the deadline. And that came down to somebody actually signing something off that was outside of our team. But the lesson I learned was you get them to do it, at least 2 days in advance rather than getting them to send it to you the night before. So we'd made a couple of applications. We weren't successful for what I know now to be really, really good reasons. But what we learned from that process was just invaluable. We also got feedback from our assessors, but we also got support from the KTN. So we had one of the KTN staff talk us through the whole process, help us with our application, and then support us when we weren't successful, and encourage us to try again. So that, I think, was very helpful. In terms of the environment.
Yeah, what did you do differently in your successful application? What do you think, what was it down to?
It was down to several things. I think one of the key things was we were very ambitious in our first asks, and we weren't really tried and tested. We're a startup, we're a very high risk startup. We are med tech. So we're building a device, which of course is very costly, high risk, and we really couldn't have done that without non-dilutive funding, which really helped us to lever investment elsewhere. And that was a key, it was a game changer for us. It wasn't just getting the Innovate UK money, which was really essential. It was how that also drove the extra funding that we needed. But I think where we went right this time was we spoke to a lot of people who'd also applied. And one of their tips was go small the first time, make sure that the project is right size for what you want to do, but go and do that and establish, that you're within the scope, but that you're doing something credible. I think as a very early startup, our ambition kind of got the better of us. So that was a key thing, getting feedback from other companies who'd applied and been successful. We were very, very careful about the scope. We'd learned, the lessons from our previous applications. And I think that we did have that golden thread that Joel alluded to. I think we managed to get that right the last time. We were very clear on reading the scope and the eligibility of where we fitted in and where our project would fit in. So we fitted in with underneath the industrial challenges. And we were very clear about getting that right. So I think those key aspects, making sure we were well in the scope, that we took all the feedback we've had from the unsuccessful applications, and we were very careful in terms of our costing and the size of the project.
Mm-hmm. And how were you monitored during the process when you actually got your funding? How does that work?
So before we even started, we've applied for a few competitions. We applied for Open Call, we applied for the Digital Catalyst, and Smart Award is the one that we got. So I don't know what the process is like for those other ones when you're successful, but for Smart Award, there was the successful applicants briefing. And that was very clear in terms of what the expectation was from Innovate UK. So we started off with that. And then we have a project monitoring officer. And then there's a sort of a tier behind that at Innovate UK as well. Our project monitoring officer has been fabulous. We're maybe particularly fortunate in that he's based in England, but he was in Northern Ireland for a long time. So he knows everybody. So he's also very good at kind of steering us to talk to other people as well. So we get a lot of added value. And I think that was one thing maybe that didn't necessarily come out earlier. The added value, not just in levering, other funding, because that's huge, but the connections that Innovate UK can help you with, and your monitoring officer's support is huge. COVID obviously happened by the time we put our application in, it had already happened, but we started in November last year. We had a really short time frame. We finished on the 30th of June, which was always a very ambitious time frame. And we've had a lot of issues around supply chain. Global demand for electronics, for example, has been a big issue for everybody, including us. The Smart Award does not permit any extension. And even though we were told that at the applicant's pre-briefing, we'd kind of forgotten. So we got reminded about that, which was only right and correct. And it's really helped to marshal us and our subcontractors to make sure that we meet our deadlines. So, and our monitoring officers really supported us through that and really helped us. In terms of the process, you have quarterly meetings and you give your update you have to write an exploitation plan and you update against that. We're over-delivering in terms of our outputs at the end, so far. So it's been a really positive experience, actually. And I suppose a little bit about the application process in itself. it's not as onerous as people might think. It really is quite straightforward. And then once you start your project, again, that kind of follows through. It's a very clear process. And as long as you follow the process, you're fine.
Susan, I think Lorraine wants to ask a question of you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us, Susan, particularly since your project finishes in a week. I'm sure you're all busy. Yeah. So I guess, Joel and I have both perhaps overemphasized the competitive nature of the funding. And what I don't want to do is scare anybody. And so a question I'd love for you to answer is actually, given your whole experience, you applied to us 3 times, it's super competitive because you've experienced that first time. Why did you want to apply to Innovate UK in the first place? And why did you continue to apply? It sounds to me it wasn't just about the money, and I guess you've alluded to that, but if you could just talk a bit about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely, happily. And to be fair, we've had funding from within Northern Ireland, as you say. It's a good environment to be in. We have been the recipients of Techstart NI Concept Plus Award, which is great. We have an Invest NI client exec, and we're working with her very closely. But to me, there was a lot about the value add from Innovate UK. I'm not suggesting there's anything, about the branding for other funding sources. They are great, and Invest and I have a huge profile, obviously, locally. But there's something I think about Innovate UK that plugs you into a whole network. And for us, our main market, our nearest market, I should say, is the UK. And we're in respiratory, and there's a huge unmet need in terms of asthma in the UK. So being able to get closer to other potential collaborators and that whole network, and to broaden that out, was a real attraction for us. And I said that the brand around Innovate UK as well, that certainly helped us to lever. And if you're thinking about the commercialization piece, which we've had to do from the outset, you're constantly looking to see where you can get your funding from, and having that non-dilutive element from any source, of course, is a huge de-risk for investors. But I think there is definitely something about the Innovate UK brand that identifies you as, as a bit lower risk because you've got the non-dilutive funding, but also you've been through a very rigorous process in terms of innovation. It's been assessed by very high caliber assessors. So, again, you're de-risking that for investors. So yeah, a lot of that was around the brand and that network of support that we can plug into. Great.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm going to open up now to some wider questions. Question for you, Joel's come in. Would Joel recommend any difference in approach when applying for energy-related grants, e.g. the IETF? Eligibility was difficult to assess.
Not from my perspective. I think the same kind of things that I tried to get across, general sort of pointers apply no matter what kind of funding you're applying for. If you have questions though around, eligibility, or it's not clear, then study the criteria and the guidance, and if it's still not clear, follow up with the helpline that Lorraine talked about. All that should be referenced in the call guidance. Sometimes KTN people are named on some of the calls as well to provide advice, and even if they're not, if you look at the KTN website, you can sign up for newsletters, and you can start to connect with some of the teams there in that space, and talk to them about what you're thinking about doing, and see if they know about the call, for example, and can give you a bit of a steer. So yeah, talk to the guidance, phone the helpline, and chat to some of the KTN as well if you can.
Great, thank you. And then another question is, how advanced would you think the project idea should be before even considering going for a grant application?
I think that from my perspective, that very much depends on the particular grant that you're applying for and the scope of the competition. The one that I applied for before in my own right years back was an SBRI, which was 2 phases, and the first phase was pretty much you had an idea that you wanted to test. So that was pretty early stage, and I was working on my own when I applied for that. And phase 2 then takes that a stage further. But even within some calls, some competitions, they allow for earlier stage, kind of middle stage, and closer to market. So it really depends on the competition you're applying for.
Great, thank you. And then with respect to live projects, how soon does the claim funding be reimbursed from Innovate UK from a cash perspective?
So it depends on the competition, and again, that'll be laid out in the guidance, but we typically pay in arrears, 3 monthly in arrears. Susan, I don't know what your experience is.
So the Smart Award, it was 30 days in arrears.
Okay.
And I suppose for us and for any startup, depending on what your cash flow issue is, and we were very early stage, you do have to find or identify the 30% gap in the SMART award, which is fine, and you can do that. I think reasonably readily via loans, all sorts of things you can incorporate. But then you have to start your project, and you're not going to get any money for 4 months. So make sure that you can do that. And again, as a company going through the process, we were probably a little bit slow getting our first claim in, and so it took a little bit longer than planned. The last quarter, we got reimbursed, I think it was 22 days. So it's it can be very fast. And again, your monitoring officer will support you to do that. So it's not as difficult as often people imagine it to be. And I hear people saying, oh, it takes forever. It actually is pretty fast.
That's good to hear. We did run a competition last year, and we've got one that just closed a couple of weeks ago where we've paid in advance, which is unusual. So the one last year was in response to COVID, and we knew cash flow was an issue. So there was a lot of companies in Northern Ireland successful with it. And then the Creative Industries Fund competition closed a couple of weeks ago, and I think about 80% of that project cost, or the grant rather, were paid in advance, or will be paid in advance. So we understand cash flow is an issue, particularly for small companies, and so we are looking at this for some of our programs, but typically it is as Susan says.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I guess, there is a facility in some of the awards, and SMART Award I think was included, that you can try and get your funding back monthly. And that might have been a COVID thing as well, but that was something that was raised and discussed with us too. So I think there was a degree of flexibility to be had.
Great, thank you. And do you have to be a registered company to apply for the fund that you do? And what about charity and profits? And
I think by the time you start, you have to be a company.
Mm-hmm.
But when you apply, by the time you get the funding, so I would check with customer support so you get the accurate answer. But my understanding is you could apply and not have actually registered, but once, in order to get the funding, you would need to be registered.
And what about charities and not-for-profits, Lorraine? Can they?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends on the competition. We've actually got a competition going live shortly, which is focused on healthy aging, and that's aimed specifically at social enterprises. So it does depend on the competition. I think we typically don't give funding to charities, but to be honest, I would prefer that was checked if there's charities kind of in the audience who are interested. Often they might partner with a business. Our core focus is our businesses, and we do fund universities, but that's when they work with businesses. So it'd be worth checking.
And what's the best way for people to keep up?
Joel wanted to add there. Sorry, Trudy.
I was just going to say, for KTP, charities in third sector are eligible, public sector isn't, but charities can apply provided there's a commercial case. Generally, that they can show they're going to generate some kind of profit that might be gifted to, reinvested back in the charity or whatever, but they need to show some kind of commercial case. And if they don't, then there needs to be strong societal impact that one of the research councils might pick it up instead of Innovate UK. So for KTP, charities in third sector are possible.
Yeah, grand. And Lorraine, what's the best way for people to keep up to date with the new funding opportunities that are coming online? Is there a newsletter or a website they should be looking to?
Absolutely. So we've got a newsletter. Sign up to our newsletter. You can also sign up to alerts, so that goes into your mailbox when new competitions launch. And I'd really encourage you as well to sign up to the KTN's newsletter and events, because they will flag our funding, but they're broader than Innovate UK. So they'll fund also flag European funding, for instance, or other opportunities. So yeah, absolutely, our newsletter and alerts and the KTNs.
Great. Okay, thank you all very much. That's about it for this frameworks workshop. Thank you to Lorraine and Joel and Susan for your insights and your expertise that you've shared with us today. Hopefully it's encouraged some of our participants to apply for funding. The recording of this workshop will be available on the Frameworks page of the Catalyst website. Frameworks has taken a bit of a break over the summer months, but we'll be back with the full schedule of workshops from September onwards. So to keep track of those, please sign up to the Catalyst community newsletter on the Catalyst webpage. You'll find the details there of how to register for that. Okay, so just again, thank you all very much, and good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all the best.
Bye-bye.